My friends, Bangladesh is tearing itself apart. Over the past several weeks, there have been tens of thousands of protesters that have been on the streets, with thousands of them having been injured and several hundred having been killed. The position of the leader of the country, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, has become increasingly unstable. The situation is very tense, and the world is watching ever more closely. The reason for that is because what is happening here could effectively destabilize the entire region, giving way to yet another security threat that is right on India's doorstep. It is no secret that over the past several years, a number of different power plays have been underway across Asia, and a major one is taking place right now in Bangladesh, with India, China, and the US all vying for power and influence in the region. And this, my friends, is no small matter. The country is not a lightweight. An unstable Bangladesh would be extremely detrimental to any security calculations of any of the powers in the subcontinent. With a dense population of over 171 million people, and sharing its land border almost entirely with India, this is of particular interest and note to India itself. No one wants to have an extremely unstable neighbor. But with a GDP of nearly $500 billion and the Bay of Bengal link with the Indian Ocean, Bangladesh is also a prominent power in the Indo-Pacific. Which is why, between major and upcoming powers, effectively a new type of great game has been unfolding in the country. That being said though, no power actually wants an unstable Bangladesh. The country itself doesn't really seem to care about that though. The issue that we are talking about here, the roots of the current protests that are shaking Bangladesh, can all be traced back to the liberation from Pakistan that took place back in the year 1971. Those who had fought for freedom from Pakistan were given a gift by the state, which was a very generous one. At the time that all this happened, 30% of all government jobs were to be set aside for freedom fighters and their families. It is said that this provision helped to build Bangladesh into a relatively modern democratic society. At least in comparison to the country that it left, Pakistan, where religious extremism and military high-handedness are very common. But that doesn't really matter to the protesters, who say that the reality here, 50 years later, is very different from what it was back in the 70s. And this entire thing had been started by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, also known as the father of Bangladesh, and more endearingly described as Bangbadhu, or friend of Bengal. Hasina, the current leader, is therefore naturally emotionally attached to the legacy of her father. But beyond that simple sentiment, this quota system has for the past 50 years been able to be used as a kind of instrument by the government to ensure that it has loyal supporters that are working for it, and has helped Hasina navigate the political challenges that are posed by her opponents. But okay, my friends, in order to explain these protests, the job situation, and how Bangladesh could very well collapse in and on itself unless changes come about, we're going to need to dive back into history and explain this here. First off, we have the Bangladeshi Liberation War, as it is called. This is the origin of the state's problem, but it came about in circumstances that, to anyone who is watching, will probably seem a bit obvious. You see, my friends, for centuries, the area that is now Bangladesh was part of the Bengal region of India. It was ruled by the same empires that ruled central India, from the Maurya to the Mughal, and then eventually the British. The British would take control of the region and would create their Raj in India from 1858 to 1947, and Bangladesh was at that time included within the state. We're skipping through a lot of history when we go through all this, but during the negotiations surrounding independence and the partition of British India, predominantly Muslim Bangladesh was separated from majority Hindu India. It wasn't something that was going to really work. In the Muslim League's 1940 Lahore Resolution, one of the demands was that the majority Muslim sections of the Punjab and Bengal region would be included in Muslim states rather than remaining with India. And after communal violence would break out in India, some politicians would even suggest that a united Bengali state would actually be a better solution. However, that idea had been vetoed by the Indian National Congress that was led by Mahatma Gandhi. In the end, after all of the infighting and squabbling and all the other issues, when British India finally gained its independence in August of 1947, the Muslim section of Bengal would become a non-continuous part of the new nation of Pakistan. Its new name was going to be simply East Pakistan. Now, I know that we're going to be putting all this up on a map right here, but it's really confusing for a number of the people who are watching this right now. East Pakistan was in a very odd position, to say the least. It was separated from actual Pakistan proper by a 1,000-mile stretch of just simply Indian land. It was that far apart. It was also divided from the main body of Pakistan by ethnicity and language, where Pakistanis were primarily Punjab and Pashtun people, as opposed to the Bengali East Pakistanis. They were completely different groups. This is one of those things when you study a lot of stuff with British and Indian history, is that when it came to the Raj, literally the only thing that was cared about in this division and creation of a new country was religion. As you can probably imagine, over time, that was going to create quite a number of problems. For a period of 24 years, East Pakistan would struggle under financial and political neglect from West Pakistan. It just didn't really matter all that much. Political unrest was endemic in the region, as military regimes would repeatedly overthrow democratically elected governments. Between the period of 1958 and 1962, and from 1969 to 1971, East Pakistan was officially under martial law. And yes, this final period is the one that we truly need to talk about, because this is the crisis phase that would effectively lead to the Liberation War. And here's how all this went down. So the West Pakistan government would announce the discovery of a secessionist conspiracy in East Pakistan on January 6, 1968. Naturally speaking, the government did not take kindly to this, and so police would arrest Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was president of the Awami League, or AL, on January 18, 1968. Keep this man's name in mind, this is very important for the rest of this video. 34 other individuals would also end up being arrested by the government police force, and 3 of these individuals would end up getting killed in prison. As a result, civil unrest would increase, and from this, so too did protests, both violent and peaceful. It is during this period that the government police would begin to fire on demonstrators in Dhaka. 34 other individuals were also arrested by government police, and 3 of these individuals were killed in prison. As civil unrest increased, so too did protests, both violent and peaceful. And from this unrest, government police would fire on demonstrators in Dhaka, East Pakistan, on December 7, 1968, resulting in the deaths of 2 individuals. After this, 8 opposition political parties would establish the Democratic Action Committee, or DAC, in Dhaka in order to properly organize themselves against the central government. Meanwhile, protests and violence would only escalate. Over the course of December 7, 1968 to January 30, 1969, some 675 individuals were killed in political violence in East Pakistan. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the man who we just spoke about, he was released from police custody on February 22, 1969. In response to escalating violence, a heart attack, and also an assassination attempt, President Muhammad Ayub Khan, who was the 2nd president of Pakistan, would end up scrapping the 1962 constitution and impose martial law. After doing this, he would hand over power to General Aga Muhammad Yahya Khan on March 25, 1969. At this point, there was no going back now. Instead, it was time for a general election. Legislative elections were held on December 7, 1970, and the Awami League, the AL, which was the separatist-minded party, it won 167 out of the 313 seats total in the Pakistani National Assembly. As it was, the AL also won 288 seats out of the 300 seats in the Legislative Assembly of East Pakistan. This was a clear majority, and the AL would propose to transfer powers from the federal government to the state government in order to provide more autonomy and try to retain the country itself. But that wasn't going to happen. While all this was going down, some 170 individuals were killed in political violence in Dhaka from March 1st to March 3rd of 1979. West Pakistani troops would fire on Bengali demonstrators in Jaipur on March 19th, 1971, resulting in the deaths of some 50 individuals. And it wasn't going to end there. West Pakistani troops would also fire on Bengali demonstrators in Saidapur, in Rangpur, and Chittagong on March 24th, 1971, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,000 individuals. President Aga Muhammad Yahya Khan would then declare a state of emergency in East Pakistan on March 25th, 1971. Considering what had just happened and the elections that had taken place, talks between the two Pakistans failed. And so it was then that on March 27th, 1971, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman would declare Bangladeshi independence from Pakistan. The Pakistani army would of course try to fight to stop the secession, but when this happened, India would send troops in order to support the Bangladeshis. Now, we're not going to go into full details of this war and how it all went down. That could easily be a podcast episode by itself, but needless to say, Bangladesh won. And so on January 11th, 1972, Bangladesh would become an independent parliamentary democracy. This was big, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman would become the first leader of Bangladesh Bangladesh, and he would remain in charge from 1972 until he would end up being assassinated in 1975. The current Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina Wajed, she is his daughter, and we will be getting into that later because if this whole thing sounds incredibly messy, yes, it really is. But this is what gives us the quota system that the modern day Bangladeshis are furious about. Now, my friends, when I talk about this, quotas are not exactly anything new. This is something that whether you support it or not in the modern day in a variety of different fields, that doesn't matter. It is a reality of history. Though they can potentially equalize the social field in companies, states, or countries, simultaneously quota systems open up their participants to a whole host of problems, namely people being hired without actually having merit for the job, and lots of corruption. In this case of Bangladesh, this is going to be tied to the bureaucratic civil service, something that, when compared to the private sector, generally receives better pay, benefits, protections, and much more, which makes it a highly desirable thing to have in a country where almost 20% of the population live in poverty. Keep that in mind, it's very important. To explain why this is a big deal, the history of civil service in this region goes all the way back to the British period. Until the early 20th century, the Imperial Civil Service, or the ICS as it was known then, was largely dominated by European officers. You had Europeans who were leading and controlling just about every part of the bureaucracy. But after the First World War, following a British parliamentary resolution, a quota was instituted for Indian candidates in the ICS. The goal was to create a mix of 40% European officers with 40% Indian officers and 20% officers being promoted from the provincial civil service. The British Raj would also make provisions for direct recruitment from Indian minority groups like Muslims in order to raise their representation in the ICS. Considering what we're talking about here for a transitionary period in between being a colony and actually being independent, this is something that does make sense as to why you would want to have this. But following the partition of 1947 in the newly formed country of Pakistan, the civil service came to be known as the Civil Service of Pakistan, or CSP. Alongside these, there were other central services of the government alongside provincial services. Shortly after partition in 1947, quota provisions were made for public service recruitment in Pakistan through an executive order. This was followed up then in the 1956 Constitution, where these provisions were solidified. To explain this further, to get an idea of what I'm talking about here, one of the first quota provisions that can be found from the Pakistan period was for the Central Superior Services, or CSS, which included recruitment to important positions in tax and customs, railways, and foreign services, things that were extremely valuable and potentially very powerful positions within the government. In it, only 20% of recruitment was given for merit positions. That's it. The remaining 80% was reserved for people from the various different provinces of Pakistan. It was more important to the government at this time to have a wider representation of people than to actually have skilled people doing a job. As the largest and most populous province, East Pakistan ended up being assigned a quota of 40% of this number. They actually had quite a bit of authority. So it was then that after 1971, the quota system was carried over and amended to reflect the needs of the newly independent Bangladeshi state. In 1972, through an order that was issued by the Ministry of Cabinet Services, the quota system for the new Bangladesh Civil Service, or BCS, this was introduced at the time. In this initial quota system, 30% of the jobs were to be reserved for freedom fighters, these being people who had actually fought in order to gain independence from Pakistan. 10% were supposed to be given to affected women from the Liberation War, as in they had lost husbands, brothers, sons, anything like that. And 40% were supposed to be given to people of various different districts, again, in order to try and increase the number of people that would be able to be brought up into the government from various positions all across the country. What that meant was that there was only a 20% allocation on merit for recruitment to government jobs. Yes, my friends, you heard me right. In a newly established country where everything is uncertain, only 20% of some of the most powerful jobs and positions in the entire state were awarded to people not based on merit, but all of these other factors. This is arguably not a good thing economically, but politically at the time, it was quite popular, allowing the government to maintain workers that were loyal to it, and these numbers were things that were going to end up changing over time. After all, there was no guarantee that a soldier would even want to go and be a bureaucrat. Or that, for that matter, after a couple years, there would even be enough of them left to fill a position in the first place. As an example of this, in 1976, the district-based allotment was reduced down to 20%. It was less important at this point about getting representation position, and more so about getting more skilled workers in, and so 40% of the jobs were reserved for those who qualified on merit. This was changed again in 1985 when, as it turns out, the quota for war-affected women, like that 10% number, that was going mostly unclaimed. Like, women who were affected by the war simply were not applying to the jobs, which meant that a bunch of them were never being fulfilled. Like, imagine this, you have 10 people, like 10 men that go and apply for a position, but because 0 women applied for it, no one gets the job. This was obviously going to be a problem, so an amendment was made to then reserve 10% of jobs for all women, not just those who'd been affected by the war, with the 30% freedom fighters quota remaining unchanged, while the district-based quota was then dropped to 10%. The 10% that was taken, though, did not go to merit. Only 5% was increased towards the actual merit numbers. Instead, a new 5% quota was introduced for members of indigenous communities. This would then leave us with 45% of public jobs to be reserved for those who actually qualified based on merit. This would continue on for the next decade or so until another change started to be seen. In 1997, as the numbers of those who were claiming freedom fighters job positions, when those numbers started to drop, the government realized that it wasn't going to have enough people who had fought in the war over 20 years ago. And so, instead, they opened up the quota system to children of freedom fighters. In 2010, this was then further expanded to include the grandchildren of freedom fighters. So think about this right here. At this point, regardless of how you feel about political quotas or jobs or anything like that, now we have a system here in which people are being awarded the best and safest jobs in the country, not by virtue of what it is that they did, not by virtue of their war participation, not by virtue of any of that, it is by virtue of their ancestors. They are getting a job based on who their father or grandfather was. Which I know right now a number of people in the comment section are going to be saying, hey, that already is the case. Yeah, but maybe you have a connection. But not a quota that is legally enshrined in law. In 2012, only 2 years later, the government would add a 1% quota for people with disabilities, which that's not inherently a bad thing. Making sure that people who have disabilities getting employed can inherently be a good thing, but the percentage point that is, the 1%, was taken from people with merit. So instead of 45, only 44% of jobs were now reserved to people based on merit. You can probably see then why this would upset a large number of people. The issue with all of this, my friends, is that as time goes on, this would cause more and more unrest amongst the discriminated student population who were deprived positions despite them scoring higher than the candidates who would fall under any kind of quota status. And that would lead to a series of protests. You would see protests in 2008 and 2013, which at the time were largely unsuccessful, but also there would end up being one in 2018, after which things actually got violent, and then you would see some changes. At least initially when I'm talking about this. On the 8th of April 2018, hundreds of students began protesting in Shahbag after 2 p.m. The protesters were organizing under the name of the Council to Protect Students' Rights, and the demand that they had was that the quota system needed to be reformed. They wanted to bring down quotas altogether to only 10%. It did not matter whether you were a woman, disabled, a descendant of a freedom fighter, or anything like that. Only 10% of jobs they wanted to be reserved for those people, and the remaining 90% be based on merit. As these protests broke out, things became rather violent. At 7:30 p.m., police would start to lob tear gas, as well as charge with batons and use water cannons on the crowd. By 8:30 p.m., protesters were being attacked by a group of Bangladesh Chhatra League activists, which is a student militia that has been used by the government for purposes, let's say, outside of the law. Namely, this is a group of politically active students that are used for intimidation, beatings, and torture. As for how bad this got, more than 160 protesters were injured in the clashes that took place at Dhaka University campus. All of this would go on for months in campuses across Bangladesh, until finally, in the wake of the movement, the Cabinet of the Government of Bangladesh on the 3rd of October 2018 issued a circular that would dismiss the quota system entirely for the recruitment in 9th to 13th grades, formerly known as the first and second class jobs. Mind you, this was not perfect, it wasn't a complete removal, but considering how many more positions were now going to become available for merit, this was a huge step up. At least it was at the time. Victory was not going to last. But before it is that we address that, one needs to understand when watching this video that the economy of Bangladesh is not exactly doing so hot. As I recently said, almost 20% of the country lives in poverty. Now, that is not to say that the growth of Bangladesh has not been impressive. Bangladesh made significant progress over the past decade, bringing down the poverty level from 41.5% in 2006 down to 18.7% by 2022. That is a huge jump that would benefit tens of millions of people in a population that has over 170 million as it is. However, like many countries that I've spoken about on this channel that rapidly develop and gain wealth, such as China and Vietnam, with increased money and opportunity, so too comes increased corruption. According to Washington-based anti-corruption watchdog Global Financial Integrity, from the period of 2004 to 2013, Bangladesh lost an average of $5.5 billion annually through illicit outflows. Like the money was not going to places that it actually needed to go to. It was being siphoned away. Bangladesh also did not receive all of its export receipts, as billions of dollars would end up being siphoned off annually through trade misinvoicing, where items simply wouldn't arrive at one location, they would go to another, get stolen by one group. You never really knew where anything was going to go. This would continue over the course of the decades, and several high-profile corruption scandals have surfaced in recent months, which stir widespread anger at a time of very deep economic pain for many Bangladeshis. As an example of just one of these things, back on the 14th of July, just earlier this month, in a press conference, Sheikh Hasina would admit that one of the people in her household staff had somehow managed to amass a fortune that was the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars. Mind you, this is not even a major politician or anything like that. This is a household staff member. How it is that a person like that could somehow magically become so rich, we don't really know. And the thing is, she doesn't either. She claimed that she did not understand how it is that he had become so rich. But to many Bangladeshis, it has come as no surprise that a person that is close to power could accumulate vast amounts of wealth very rapidly. Corruption is unfortunately something that reportedly permeates almost every aspect of recruitment for government jobs, meaning that quotas are just the most tangible element of what many Bangladeshis consider a rotten system of preferential state employment. The way that students perceive all of it is that many of the supposedly merit-based positions just go to those with money or connections to the ruling party. Like, even if you have someone that scores better, if they're not part of the quota system already in some way, they can merely bribe someone to get a position anyway. This is really bad, because at the same time, graduates also face a much higher level of unemployment than the general population. Like, it is actually harder to get a job, as there are not nearly as many educated positions that one can get as a student, or rather a graduate, in comparison to just a general laborer, which makes competition for these kinds of posts incredibly fierce. In regards to the economy itself, before the pandemic had hit back in early 2020, Bangladesh was growing at an average of more than 6% annually, which is pretty decent, something that was fueled by garment exports, agricultural, and huge government investment in infrastructure, such as bridges, roads, and highways. The state was rapidly developing, and I need to go ahead and address this now because I am sure that many people on this channel are already familiar with what happens with a lot of these governments when they turn to infrastructure to try to stimulate their economies. Go ahead and guess down in the comment section below. Basically, the gist of it is that since coming to power in 2009, the Hasina government has undertaken several large infrastructure projects funded by various different countries and multilateral agencies. These projects include the Padma Bridge, a nuclear power plant in Raipur, Dhaka City Metro Rail, and Karnapuli Tunnel, just to name a couple of these. There's a lot of projects. Not only are there a lot of them, but they are big. Padma Bridge, as an example, is one of the largest projects in the country, and it cost around $3.6 billion. That is already a big amount, but that is way bigger than the estimated $1.16 billion that they had said that it would cost back in the year 2007. The ambitious nuclear power plant has already cost Bangladesh $12.65 billion, but the actual amount that is going to be spent on operating this thing is not going to be known until it is fully commissioned. The Metro Rail project is something that would balloon up to $3.3 billion when it had originally estimated to only cost 2.1. The cost of the underwater Karnapuli Tunnel, that had managed to reach $1.03 billion, though originally it was only estimated to cost $803 million. Of course, when we talk about government projects, it is natural to expect that things are not going to maintain within budget. There are going to be differences, things are going to happen. Unfortunately, these are not exceptions, these are patterns. In 2017, the World Bank would note that the cost of road construction in Bangladesh was somehow the highest in the world. As for why that is the case, the cost overrun is largely because of overpricing of materials, corruption, and extremely long delays that would end up driving up costs as time goes on. Now, that is not to say that these things failed. No, growth for the economy was achieved, despite several structural flaws in it that are becoming more and more visible as time goes on, and the growth that we talked about before has been steadily dropping. That, right there, is one of the primary problems. Published on April 2nd, 2024, the World Bank's Bangladesh Development Update would forecast that the country's gross domestic product was only going to grow by 5.6% in the fiscal year of 2024. This GDP growth projection by the World Bank is something that sharply contrasts with the government's initial projection for the fiscal year, which had said that, it was going to grow by 7.5%, but then they realized that this wasn't going to happen and they revised it down to 6.5. Still, that is quite a big difference. They are way more optimistic in Bangladesh, or at least the government is, than what the rest of the world thinks. Analysts have largely described the government's growth target as simply unachievable. The country's average GDP growth over the past decade, according to government statistics, was around 6.6%. So them somehow assuming that they were going to jump it up to 7.5 despite having more problems was extremely overly optimistic. Instead, the World Bank's forecast suggests that Bangladesh's economic growth has been on a steady downward trend for 2 consecutive years, and that the projection for next year is not going to be different, it's just going to keep on dropping. This is creating a kind of economic crisis in Bangladesh, something which has been very obvious and evident since the middle of 2022, as it's not something that appeared suddenly and magically out of the air from external factors. No, this is a crisis that has been in the making for quite some time. 2 years ago, Bangladesh had reached out to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and other international lenders in order to avoid a complete meltdown. The government at the time did manage to secure new loans, but these would only add onto several existing external loans already. For the first time in its history, external debt would surpass $100 billion in late 2023. And as a result, the cost of servicing that debt was increasing at an unprecedented rate. In the first 8 months of this last fiscal year, the country spent $2.03 billion making payments on this debt. That debt servicing, not only the foreign but also domestic sources, is forcing the government to have to borrow even more money in order to be able to pay its debt obligations. It has to go further into debt to pay its debt. That, in turn, is putting a serious dent in Bangladesh's foreign exchange reserves, which over time have continued to drop, as I have already mentioned is happening with several other countries. Their foreign exchange reserves would drop below the IMF's suggested $19.26 billion that they should have, and it's only getting worse. This is already pretty bad, but at the same time that this is happening, a banking crisis is gradually building up within the country, as non-performing bank loans are increasing in number. In the past 15 years, the amount has increased 6.5 times what it previously was. That is right, the number of bank loans that would be considered in default or bad or not worthwhile now at this point make up over 10% of the loans in the country. Faced with pressure from the IMF to reduce the defaulting loans, the Bangladesh Bank has devised a rather sneaky and stealthy way to fix things, which is essentially by just lying and cooking the books. What the Bangladeshi bank would do was decide to relax the write-off policy, which would allow them to wipe off a large amount of loans from the books and simultaneously hold no one accountable for it, like the banks could just write it off as a loss and get rid of it. Neither the banks nor the businesses that had the bad loans in the first place would ever be placed at fault. Instead, what would happen is that a recent amendment to the Bank Company Act would allow sister companies of the defaulting companies to just continue to borrow money. Because get this, at this point, it wasn't the company itself that had failed horribly due to mismanagement or bad business decisions. No, that was a completely new company. Instead, they could just start anew under a new name and continue to borrow money, even when nothing was actually going to work out. And that is bad, but the banks aren't really any better. The Bangladeshi bank would decide to merge weak banks with strong banks as part part of its banking sector reform program. In April of this year, the World Bank would describe this move as being extremely counterproductive, and experts would question whether or not this was actually a smart decision. What it would do is it would force the liabilities of weak banks onto the depositors of strong banks, meaning that if there was a bank that had horrible business practices and wasn't actually performing well, it wasn't actually their customers that was going to be liable, it was going to be the responsibility of the bigger banks that had way more assets. Many of the banks identified by the central bank as weak were approved in the past 15 years for political considerations. Yes, they were friendly with the government. The benefits that were being enjoyed by those who established these banks and borrowed from other various banks were now being paid by the public at large and their own tax and bailout dollars. As you can probably imagine, the broad economic crisis is having some serious consequences for Bangladeshis, especially those in the middle class and the poorer segments of society. While official statistics from February would claim that inflation was below 10%, which is still very high, the prices of food and essentials on the market indicate that the real prices are much, much greater. Although technically speaking, food and fuel prices have fallen in the global market, Bangladeshis have not enjoyed this same kind of benefit. Instead, the government in March would once again raise the price of electricity. This is bad because in 2023 alone, this past year, the government had already raised the price of electricity and gas 3 separate times. For most Bangladeshis, this is a very scary thing, because remember when I said that almost 20% of the entire country lives in poverty. In a BBS survey that was conducted back in the middle of 2023, the study would reveal that around 37.7 million people were experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity in the country. The report would also note that more than a quarter of families were taking out loans to cover the cost of daily necessities, including food. That's right, my friends, you heard me. Over 25%, not of even people, of families, that is, multiple people in households in the country, have to take out loans in order to be able to buy things like food. So, my friends, for those of you who have stuck around this long, you understand now that Bangladesh's economy is struggling. There is raging inequality between the population, the national debt is soaring, and government jobs, which are often seen as the most stable form of employment with lifelong benefits, only 3.1% of the total population is able to get a job like this in the first place. That's it. With a size of only 3.1%, this means that Bangladesh's public sector is quite small actually for a population of its size. Every year, only around 4,000 government positions open up, only 4,000 jobs become available, and more than 300,000 students try to compete for just these 4,000. Now, do you see why this is such a big deal? As you can imagine, with so few jobs that were available, in 2018, this would push the country to the brink of exploding as people wanted the system gone. Politically speaking, Hasina's support for the provision would only fuel further anti-incumbency efforts, and this movement was quickly co-opted by the opposition who wanted her out. So, under pressure, Hasina would act with sweeping executive orders. She removed all reservations in civil service, removing not just the 30% quota, but also those for women and other communities. This came as a shock for the students, who really, at the time, only wanted the freedom fighter quota to go. And so you think, wow, okay, awesome. This would make her a woman of the people, right? But the reality is that things are far more contentious than that. You see, my friends, politically, there has been a gradual authoritarian drift under the Awami League government that has made it increasingly unpopular over time. Since the year 2013, authorities have charged tens of thousands of opposition members with various different offenses, while enforced disappearances as well as extrajudicial killings, including that of activists, have become increasingly regular occurrences. Bangladesh is not exactly a place for free speech. Draconian censorship laws have seen more than 1,000 people arrested in recent years, mainly for social media posts that just criticize the government, their officials, and actions. Furthermore, since Hasina won the 2008 election, Bangladesh has not had a genuinely competitive national poll. You may wonder, well, what do I mean? They've had elections, haven't they? Well, yes, but in January of this year, in 2024, the government oversaw another stage-managed election in which the ruling party would win around 75% of the seats. Which is a lot. Generally speaking, in democracies, that does not happen, and the government tried to do everything that it could to make the vote look competitive. As an example of what I'm talking about, around 20% of the seats were lost to independent candidates who were in reality just members of the ruling party, but would then run as something else to give the impression that there was actually more variety than there were. Why is that the case though? Well, the official turnout of the election, the actual amount of people that voted, is only around 42%, at least according to the government, which is already low, but it's anticipated that reality is that the number is much lower, and Bangladeshis are not being fooled by this. The main opposition party, the BNP, the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, had earlier launched a mass movement to try and pressure the government into accepting its demands for fairer election conditions in the run-up to the vote. Of course, the government did not want that, as they had already been in charge for many years, and police and the Chhatra League would eventually break up a major rally in October of 2023, with numerous BNP leaders being jailed. When this happened, it persuaded the rest of the party to boycott the vote, and so the only real opposition party, the only real force that was not already part of the government, refused to participate in the next election, and they just outright won. I've touched upon a lot of different topics here, politically, economically, socially, all these varying things. You would understand then why this is such a confusing issue. And that, my friends, is exactly what leads us into 2024, when everything that I've described here, the economic, the political, the social factors, all of this would collide in the high courts of Bangladesh. Because on the 5th of June 2024, the High Court would declare the 2018 government circular canceling the 30% quota for freedom fighters' descendants in government jobs illegal. After 6 years, this ruling would turn back the clock and bring back the system of preferential treatment. This would infuriate the public. After the court decision, online activism would immediately start against the verdict. Initial protests were staged in early June, mainly concentrated in the capital of Dhaka, but these were later discontinued due to summer holidays. After all, with the protesters that we're talking about in this case are students, and they had to go back home. But after the holiday, peaceful demonstrations by the students would restart on the 1st of July, while public university teachers would then declare their own strike that was protesting the new universal pension scheme, which would cause universities to close. As time went on, demonstrations began to spread nationwide, as the movement became headed by a newly organized anti-discrimination students movement, this being an umbrella organization for the student protesters. As time went on, the movement would only grow in size, and on the 7th of July, protesters would start the nationwide Bangla blockade, this being something where they would organize traffic and rail obstruction with demonstrations in major cities as well as metropolises. Now, the government was not stupid. They didn't want things to get worse, and so in response, the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, the Appellate Division, would order a 4-week status quo regarding the quota system on the 10th of July. Basically, even though the quota system was supposed to be introduced, they weren't going to be doing this immediately. Instead, they were going to kind of pause things, let it settle down, and then see about things later. However, this was not going to stop things though. Protests would continue, and protesters would demand a real and lasting solution from the government. As for the actual government's response, well, that would be violence. The very next day, police were going to begin to clash with students. And this was only going to get worse when on the 14th of July, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina would make very controversial statements that would only escalate the situation further. And if you want to know what I mean, well, this is what I'm talking about. Check this out. On the 14th of July, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina would say, and I quote, "If the grandchildren of freedom fighters don't get quota benefits, will those then go to the grandchildren of the Razakars? That's my question, the countryman's question." Which I'm sure for those of you watching, you're probably looking at me with a degree of confusion. You don't know what that is. What is a Razakar? Well, allow me to explain. At the very beginning of this video, when I talked about the Bangladeshi Liberation War, the Razakars were a paramilitary force that during that war collaborated with Pakistani forces to halt the independence of Bangladesh. If you wanted to compare this to anything, it's like in the case of the United States, where you had people that were patriots or loyalists. So, in modern Bangladesh, the term Razakar is something that is used as a pejorative to indicate that someone is a traitor or a collaborator. It is a grievous insult. In response to the Prime Minister's comment in the early hours of the 15th of July 2024, students began to use slogans and signs that would say, "Who are you? Who am I? A Razakar, a Razakar. Who has said it? The autocrat. The autocrat." Protesters were turning the entire thing up upon its head like some kind of dark joke, saying that they only sought their rights, but somehow they got turned into a Razakar, a traitor. The protesters would argue that the Prime Minister's statement would indirectly label them as razakars and demeaned them for advocating for quota reform, which is why they would adopt the slogan in the first place. So yes, for those watching, people are trying to get jobs based on merit, and for doing this, they are getting called traitors by the government. This is not exactly a healthy thing. Soon after this, attacks against protesters would begin, as the ruling Awami League's general secretary would say that the Bangladesh Chhatra League, the student wing of the ruling party, was ready to give a fitting reply to quota protesters and for their, quote, arrogant behavior. If that is not a threat, I don't know what else is. The reply, of course, would be an extreme escalation on the 15th of July, 2024. Later in the evening of the 15th, Chhatra League members would attack students inside of Bijoy Ekator Hall of Dhaka University, where some of the attackers were seen shooting with pistols and carrying sticks to attack students. In response, the protesters would throw bricks from the inside of the hall to try and retaliate. As all of this was going down, while covering the protests at the University of Dhaka, 2 journalists would end up getting assaulted and injured. This would go on in other places, and by 5:30 p.m. that same day, members of the Chhatra League would attack the emergency department of the Dhaka Medical College Hospital, where over 200 students had already gathered who had been injured in the previous clashes and were trying to get treatment. After several attempts to try and break into the building throughout the afternoon, Chhatra League members, some of them wearing helmets, would forcibly enter the building and start attacking people. Many observers who watched people enter the building would note that they were carrying metal rods, wooden sticks, and even Chinese axes as they targeted individual students who were injured and vandalized a series of ambulances to try and get into them. Again, to attack the students. This is not the only thing that went down. A lot more was happening all across the country, mind you, but I could easily spend the better part of the next hour listing every single thing that happened, and there simply isn't enough time. We would just be ragging on about the same thing. So we're only going to be mentioning some of the daily actions as it happened as things unfolded across the state. The next day, on July 16th, there would be a violent incident involving police and students that would take place in front of Begum Raka University in Rangpur between 2:30 p.m. and 3 p.m. Police would resort to lathi charges, which, for those who are confused, this is basically like a baton charge. Like, the police are using sticks that are lathi, basically bamboo sticks, and then charging at protesters to hit them and drive them away. In addition to this, reports came of police just firing into the crowd. Reportedly, a student named Abu Saeed would die after being brought to the hospital with gunshot wounds. As students in public universities were forcibly vacated, students from various different schools, colleges, and private universities would join in on the cause. They would protest, block roads, and do anything they could to generally be a nuisance against the government. In addition to roads, students would also try to block railway lines in Chattagram and Mohakali. The Dhaka Chattagram, the Dhaka Barsal, the Dhaka Rajshahi, and the Dhaka Tangail highways were also blocked. Effectively, anything and everything that was leading in or out of the capital was cut off. By evening, it had gotten so bad that the Ministry of Education announced the indefinite closure of schools and colleges as the government was trying desperately to quiet the unrest. That, however, would just give students more time to protest. The next day, on July 17th, clashes would erupt between police and students at a funeral prayer program that was organized by student protesters. These protesters, the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, and other parties had tried to honor 6 individuals who had been killed on the 16th of July for the quota reform movement, and from this, things got violent between them and the police. The government would in turn order all students to leave the residential halls of campuses, but they would be refused. In response, the police were sent in to forcibly evacuate the halls by any means necessary. By this time, things were most certainly getting out of hand, and the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, would address the nation at 7:30 p.m. that night, where she would announce a judicial probe into the deaths during the anti-quota protests and urged people to please have patience until the Supreme Court could deliver its verdict, emphasizing justice for the students and also condemning violence. But of course, it's not going to end there, it's only going to get worse. On July 18th, police would use tear gas and batons and would clash with BRAC university students on the streets of Bada. Reports would later indicate that approximately 30 students had been killed by the Bangladeshi police. That same day, protesting students would storm the headquarters of the state-owned television network, Bangladesh Television, and would commit an arson attack trying to burn it to the ground. As a result, the network would have to shut down for a time. To get word of what was happening out there, out of the country and in people's minds, to organize more, the websites of the Bangladeshi police, the central bank, the Prime Minister's office, even the Chhatra League itself, all were hacked by pro-protester groups in order to spread the message. The government, in response to everything, would then shut down metro services inside of the capital. Nothing was going to get in or out. But worse yet, around 9 p.m. that day, the government would shut down internet access across the entire country. No one was going to be allowed to organize any more protests, and information on state violence was halted from leaking out to the wider world. The interesting thing to note about this here is that it didn't just stop protests from occurring. One of the consequences of shutting down the internet was that many people were not able to top up their electricity meters, which meant that many people were left without power during this period because there was no internet. But either way, the next day, on July 19th, the Dhaka Metropolitan Police, in an attempt to try and stop student protesting, would announce the indefinite suspension of public gatherings and processions. No one was going to be allowed to do anything in the street, regardless of who they were. All trains leading to the capital were ordered to stop, as the government did not want any more students from other parts of the country to try to converge onto one place. Still, if they couldn't get to the capital, that wasn't going to stop the protesters though, as throughout the country, protest largely would continue, and many of them would turn violent. Around 12:45 p.m., after protesters in the Kishoreganj district would surround a police station, police would fire into the crowd from within the building and would subsequently injure over 100 students. Elsewhere, clashes between students and police would result in more casualties and vandalization, with the Mirpur 10 and Kazipara metros receiving over $40 million worth of damages. That is already crazy, but there is more. In Narsingdi, as an example, protesters would storm a prison that was there and release hundreds of inmates before setting the facility on fire. As chaos was taking over the country, the government had to stop it. They imposed a curfew at midnight and deployed troops nationwide. Everything was set to be shut down. And this, my friends, is effectively how things would function for the next several days. During this time, there would be more protests, more beatings, and allegations of torture and kidnappings by police. Still though, it's not like the government could simply sit back and do nothing. They knew that something had to happen. There had to be some changes, and these were going to be announced. On July 21st, Bangladesh's Supreme Court would scrap most quotas on government jobs. Mind you, this was still not a complete removal as it had been desired, but was still quite large. Dismissing a lower court order, the Supreme Court's appellate division would direct that 93% of government jobs would be open to candidates based on merit. That is massive. Only 7% of jobs were to be awarded to people based on other characteristics. For some protesters, this was enough, but for others, it wasn't. Not after all the violence, not after everything that had happened, the protest for them was still going to continue. On July 22nd, the Anti-Discrimination Students Movement Organization would announce that it was suspending protests for 2 days, while simultaneously demanding that the government lift the curfew, restore internet, and also stop trying to target student protesters. At this point, they were ready to try a peaceful solution to resolve things. The next day, on July 23rd, the Ministry of Telecommunications would announce that the government was going to restore broadband internet services, at least to banks, business organizations, export sectors, and selected areas after the 5-day disruption. With this degree of positive progress then, the Anti-Discrimination Student Movement Organization would decide to extend their suspension of protests for another 48 hours. It seems at this point that things were finally beginning to wind down. The next day, on the 24th, the curfew restrictions were eased with a relaxation of 7 hours, which would allow banks, factories, and offices to reopen as protests started to calm down. Broadband internet services were partially restored, although social media websites still continued to be blocked as they didn't want people organizing. And that, my friends, brings us right here to today, the point in which I am making this video, a point in which things have calmed down for the most part from the chaos of mid-July, but the fundamental issues have still not fully been resolved. There is still a lot of bad blood between the students and the government, though of course the Prime Minister denies that she has any responsibility in any of this. In fact, Sheikh Hasina would go on to say just yesterday on the 26th that her Razkar comments were not true. She would say, and I quote, "I did not call the students Razkars. My comment was distorted. This is the statement that she would give during a visit to the state television service BTV. Which, yes, perhaps as a politician, she did not directly say that the students were Razcars, but the implication was most certainly there, and that is what people were upset about. At the time that I'm making this, and again, it is Saturday, July 27th, the curfew is right now still set to continue, with intermittent relaxation, as soldiers patrol streets in the nation's capital of Dhaka. As it stands, hundreds of people have been killed in the protests, and fighting with many more thousands having been injured. The government, meanwhile, has jailed 5,500-something people, mostly from the opposition parties such as the Bangladesh Nationalist Party and Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islami parties. Yesterday, Prime Minister Hasina would appeal to the nation, begging people to please help her government find those who were, quote, involved in mass destruction and arson attacks, saying, and I quote, know the real truth. Find those who are involved in these wherever they are in Bangladesh. Cooperate in punishing them. She would go on to blame the BNP and Jamaat parties for having carried out rampages across the country to damage the country's development, as well as tarnish the country's image abroad. In response, BNP Secretary General Misra Farkul Islam Almgir would say that using soldiers to suppress the righteous movement of students was never acceptable. He would in turn demand the immediate withdrawal of the curfew and the army, and expressed, quote, deep concern about the arrest and torture of ordinary people. Because yes, right now as it stands, that is still happening. Even now, a number of student leaders have been abducted by police wearing plain clothes from hospitals and schools around the country and are being held for their, quote, own safety. The government of Bangladesh, as it stands, is on very rocky ground after years of allegations of corruption and cheating domestically and in elections. Whether the current administration will resolve things or ultimately be forced out, though, that is anyone's guess. But as it stands, that is where we are today, and I've explained how it is that we got here. My friends, thank you all for watching. This has been Stakuyi with a History of Everything podcast YouTube episode. I ask that you please like, comment, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like for us to do next. I made these two back to back, and I know I said it in the previous video. I know, and I know the comments are going to be there. The video on the Taliban and the water war is coming. That is the next project that I'm working on, but I had to get these made here specifically while it is that I was in Peru and just got home to be able to record. Thank you all for all of your support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.